Everything you're hearing is from the Home Depot. From the baseboards and nails to these throw pillows, even those super soft sheets. Because now at the Home Depot, you can get everything for your bedroom, from wooden nightstands to modern benches. Save up to 25% on select bedroom furniture, plus free and flexible delivery and easy in-store returns. Shop decor now at HomeDepot.com. More saving, more kinds of doing. Valid on select items online only. Free delivery on select items $45 or more. Visit HomeDepot.com for more information.
Welcome to Creating a Family. Talk about infertility and adoption. Today we're going to be talking about the question, should you go abroad for fertility treatment? This is known sometimes as fertility tourism, although I'm not really wild about that topic, and we'll talk later about why I don't think it's a very appropriate or kind title to use. But this is a topic that comes up a lot in the world of infertility because infertility treatment is not inexpensive. So the question comes up, should I go abroad to save money? I think you're going to really enjoy this show. This show is brought to you by Creating a Family. We are the National Infertility Education and Support nonprofit. I'm Dawn Davenport, your host of this show, as well as the director of Creating a Family. You can find us and all of our resources online at creatingafamily.org. This show is underwritten and has been underwritten for a while now by our corporate sponsor, Ferring Pharmaceutical. Ferring has a free program they want you to know about. It's called My Fertility Navigator. This program offers free, obviously, one-on-one support for women who are struggling to get pregnant and really don't know what their next step needs to be. You enroll in My Fertility Navigator, and you receive a personalized guidance from a live, dedicated fertility navigator who can provide you with information about infertility and fertility as well, including lists of nearby fertility centers, information about financial resources, and can talk to you about some of your treatment options. To get more information, you can go to their website, myfertilitynav.com, myfertilitynav.com. And we thank them for their support. Today, first of all, let me stop a minute and say, before I tell you about today's show and our guest, let me remind you that this show, and as well as all the resources provided by Creating a Family, could not and would not happen without the generous support of our partners. One such partner is Cooper Genomics. They are a reproductive genetic testing laboratory, and they're focused on providing genetic tests and services for really every step along the fertility journey. They can offer you carrier screening, they can offer PGS, PGD, as well as non-invasive prenatal screening for individuals and couples who are planning a family, or if you're pursuing IVF or even early in pregnancy. They are proud to provide comprehensive genetic counseling to their patients, and I can't stress enough how important it is, if you're going to do genetic testing, to have a good qualified genetic counselor to help you understand the results. So you can get more information at their website, coopergenomics.com. Now, to tell you about the show, we're going to be interviewing today Dr. Glen Cohen. He is a Harvard professor as well as the author of a book called Patients with Passports, Medical Tourism, Law, and Ethics. The reason that I was fascinated and wanted to interview him was because he talks about both the practicality, where it makes sense, when it doesn't make sense to go abroad, and specifically we're talking here about fertility treatment, although his book covers all sorts of medical procedures, but we talk about fertility treatment. But he also talks about the ethics and things you need to think about, questions you need to ask, how you find a safe clinic if this is something you're wanting. Is it possible? Is every country an option? We cover the whole waterfront of ideas if this is something that you are considering. This is a re-air of a show we did, I think 2 years ago, or a couple of years ago. And you don't get good information on this topic. It's really hard, and so we wanted to bring it to you again because, quite frankly, we just thought it was such a strong show to begin with. I hope you enjoy. Welcome, Glen, to Creating a Family.
Thank you for having me.
I enjoyed the book. And this is a topic that I know a fair amount of, or at least in the in relation to fertility treatment, and I enjoyed the personal stories, or the case law, the cases of what can really happen, and I also appreciated that the nuanced approach, that this is a really complex area. It's really complex, and there's not really simple answers. And I thought you did a good job in the book of highlighting that. So I thank you.
Thank you for saying so.
All right. So, we think in terms of fertility tourism as from intended parents, and intended parents for our audience is the preferred term for parents who are using third-party reproduction, egg donation, sperm donation, or surrogacy, or embryo donation. And we think, so the intended parents being in the United States, going abroad. But in fact, according to your book, much of the demand is from other countries seeking this out, often coming to the United States. And I think people don't really realize that the United States is a fairly big destination for fertility tourism. Do you have any feel for how common is it for others for families, intended parents in other countries, to come to the United States?
It's not uncommon, and there are really two reasons. One is just the quality of the services we provide. We, in general, tend to be a high-quality fertility service country. But the other is that our rules about who can get access to reproductive technology are much more liberal than most of the world. So many countries have restrictions on single individuals, LGBT individuals, age limits, for example, and other kinds of regulation, for example, of sperm donor non-anonymity. And many people come to the United States because they either can't get access to the services they want in their home country, or they want to get something that's unavailable in their home country.
So specifically, what procedures bring people to the United States most often?
Yeah, so one big one is surrogacy, and commercial surrogacy in particular. So some of the United States have so in general, many countries in Europe in particular have a prohibition on commercial surrogacy. It can be criminalized, whereas in the United States, most states don't make it criminal, and indeed some states like California, for gestational surrogacy, that is where the gametes don't come from the surrogate, where the egg doesn't come from the surrogate, actually will allow robust contractual enforcement. So surrogacy is a big one, but we see people come for artificial insemination, for IVF, for ICSI, for all kinds of services. It really depends on where they're coming from.
What about gender selection?
There's some of that as well. So some of these countries have much stronger kind of prohibitions on gender selection. Gender selection, I think, you'll find if you talk to a lot of fertility doctors, they don't really want to talk about it very much, but there is some gender selection that goes on in the United States. On the flip side, there are technologies like sperm sorting technologies, microsort, for example, that we don't have licensed in the United States. So you'll have some Americans go abroad, and basically this is instead of fertilizing your embryos and then trying to figure out the gender. Instead, it makes it more likely that you will have sperm that bears the sex that you find desirable based on the way in which they kind of separate out the sperm.
What countries are leading in the microsorting for gender selection? Clearly not the United States.
Yeah, clearly not the United States. I've heard of a lot of people going to Mexico. We don't have a lot of good data, I would say, that actually kind of quantify it. The place where we have the most quantified data is actually in Europe, within Europe, where we can see actual real patterns of people moving from one European country to another, mostly for legal reasons, trying to get a service that's not available to them. The academics have done a much better job, and I think it's also part of the way in which fertility clinics are regulated in Europe, of kind of gathering data and sharing data about fertility tourism within Europe than we really have data from elsewhere in the world. The rest, we have cases, we've got anecdotes, we've got stories, but much harder to quantify.
Okay, so we've talked about the procedures that tend to bring people from abroad to the United States. What procedures, other than the one you just mentioned, microsorting for gender selection, draw U.S. citizens abroad for fertility treatment?
So I would say most U.S. citizens go abroad for fertility treatment largely for cost reasons. That tends to be the main motivator, because the costs in particular of commercial surrogacy can be much lower elsewhere in the world. So India, Thailand have been popular destinations for surrogacy. In recent years, there's been a bit of a downtick in that, in part because there's been some scandals that have kind of made those countries more sensitive. But I would say that the predominant thing that I've seen Americans travel for tends to be surrogacy services.
What about egg donation? Is that there used to be more common? Is that becoming less of a draw because the cost in the United States, I'm guessing through maybe egg banking now, has reduced the cost somewhat, or is there still a fairly strong demand pulling U.S. citizens abroad?
Well, so one thing is that a lot of the countries have kind of restricted what they'll allow to be paid for eggs, or whether they'll allow for payment for eggs at all. Canada, for example, in the last decade has kind of restricted a little bit of that market. I would say the place where I've seen the most robust discussion is actually the market for particular racial groups that are not well represented in the U.S. egg banking industry. So, for example, South Asian patients seeking to have a South Asian egg donor more likely to think about going to India than would your typical kind of white Midwestern American think about going over there. I mean, egg banking is interesting because unlike with surrogacy, where there's not a lot of phenotype, there's not a lot of traits in the child that's going to be represented by the surrogate, when it comes to egg banking, you're really looking for kind of a match. And so it depends a lot on who you are and whether the person you're seeking has the kinds of characteristics you're interested in or that match your own ethnicity, for example. That can be a big driver. But it used to be that the market for eggs in America, eggs from Jewish people, eggs from East Asians, and eggs from South Asian were harder to find as compared to eggs from the Caucasian population.
So people who are, even now, people who are seeking a specific ethnic group or religious group may well go abroad to the countries that they think that they will be able to find. That's from an egg donor standpoint, I think you're correct. I think people are generally trying to match their ethnic background, which makes, unless they are Indian by or South Asian, or unless they or their spouse is of that ethnicity, getting egg donors from that country is usually not a strong draw from them, or it hasn't been. So how do surrogacy organizations, clinics in other countries work around that? Do they get their egg donors from other countries? And in the case if they're looking for a Caucasian, are they going to Eastern European countries to get egg donors?
Yeah, typically, so in India, for example, or in Thailand, which have been, traditionally hotbeds for surrogacy tourism, I would say that most of the people come with an egg donor already identified, or even frozen eggs now along. And so you might recruit an egg donor from the United States if you're a U.S. citizen, and with the egg donor either travel with her or more likely travel with the egg or have the egg fertilized in the United States and travel with the embryos over to India and have implantation occur there. So typically what's interesting about this medical tourism in general is that often it's not just one country to another country, but there's often multiple parties, and sometimes different parts of the process are coming from different places. So it is possible, for example, to have a Ukrainian egg donor and use a surrogate in India, for example. And these lead to some fascinating issues and problems, and really that requires some sophistication to navigate, which is why I think in surrogacy in particular, the agencies and the brokerages have had a major role in kind of paving the way or not paving the way.
I mean, you're talking about such a complex issue. I mean, if you think about it, because we're going to come to that in a little bit, but once you start mixing and matching, I do know of one, and there may be others of this as well, but I know of one organization here, that Egg Donor Alliance, that is going taking sperm abroad, creating and getting an egg donor from another country. I don't. I think Eastern European, I believe, Ukraine maybe, I'm not sure, and fertilizing them over there and then shipping the embryos back to the United States. So yeah, that's another another form that this can take.
And there's a lot, and just to jump in for a second, there's just a lot that can also happen that's unexpected. So one of my favorite accounts has to do with Indian surrogates. When India changed its law on foreign surrogacy, they moved some of the women over to Nepal, and Nepal was suddenly the place to go. And then the Nepalese earthquake occurred, this huge, devastating earthquake. And in particular, the country of Israel, that had a lot of people using surrogacy, of surrogates who were then in Nepal, had to decide whether they're going to airlift them, only the ones who hadn't delivered or the ones who had delivered, and the mothers and the children together, and how to think about this. So just as to say, on top of all of the best laid plans of mice and men, sometimes things occur that are totally unexpected.
You know, that is so true. Yes, and I mean it's very complex, and partly it's complex because of some of the ethical reasons, and you just hit upon one. I mean, if the mother's already delivered, do you leave her there, or do you take the baby? It's very complex. Before we move too much further to the ethics, though, let's talk about. You said that. Most of that cost was the driving factor for most citizens of the U.S. who go abroad for seeking treatment. And for the most part, let's just get it out there that not too many people that I know of are going abroad for IVF. There are, although I'm sure that still does happen, it tends to be third-party reproduction. Have you seen anything different from that, Glenn?
No, that's exactly right. That when you factor in kind of the complications and the difficulty, the cost savings have to be significant, I think, for most people to consider this as an option. And, one nice thing about the price of IVF is, although it hasn't gone down that much, it is, I think, becoming more affordable and part of more insurance coverage in more places in America. So I tend to think that most of the focus, as you say, has been on third-party reproduction, where there's no insurance coverage. The costs are significant. You have to deal with a complicated web of other people, no matter where you do it. So I tend to think that's the place where most people are more open to thinking about traveling abroad.
Yeah, and their cost savings are greater for sure. All right, so speaking of cost saving, what roughly, within a range, what's some of the differences in price for egg donation in the U.S. and abroad? So in other words, how much money are you actually saving? And then I'm going to ask you the same question for surrogacy. So for egg donation, how much money are you really saving if you're going abroad?
So in general, with medical tourism, the kind of rule of thumb is you tend to pay about 20 to 30% of what you would pay in the United States. So that's kind of the rule of thumb. When it comes to surrogacy specifically, I'm just going into the book now. I'm going to give you some numbers of what some of the surrogates in Anand, which is a place in India, a village where surrogacy is particularly common, and this is where Dr. Patel's clinic is. So the surrogates were paid approximately 300,000 rupees, which is $7,500, which is roughly about a third of what the prospective parents pay the agency. So there's also some of it being taken up. So this is from a study in, I'll give you the year because it may be a little bit out of date now, but I think this is from roughly, let's just see, 2010, 2011, sometime around then is when these numbers come from.
Okay.
So, it's significantly less than what Americans pay for surrogacy in the United States.
Now, did you say that was what the surrogate made, or is that the total? That's not the total price.
No,
of
that's
what
the surrogate pays. So it's $7,500. So roughly 3 times that is what you're talking about. So according to this study, right? So surrogacy offered them $7,500, roughly 1/3 of what the prospective parents pay. So you'd be talking about $22,000 US for everything.
Gotcha. And that likely also covers the egg donation or just surrogacy? Actually, I'm not
sure.
So
from this study, I don't have they don't break it out in that way. My guess is it depends a little bit on whether you're coming with your own egg donor or whether you're using an egg donor from their center.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. So and the average cost of, it's a little hard to say, and it's been a while since I've looked at the numbers, but the average cost for surrogacy in the United States is going to run you, 80 to 100. Is that the numbers you're still giving?
Yeah, I would say that's about right. That's the numbers I've seen.
Yeah, so about 80 to 100,000. Yeah.
Exactly. So, again, roughly, as I said, about a third. You're paying roughly all in about a third of what you pay in the United States. Maybe 20%, 28% to 30% is basically what you're paying of the U.S. cost, which is significant.
Gotcha. Okay. And egg donation, probably a similar 20 to 30% of what you're going to pay here in the United States. And egg donation can be, anywhere from 10 to 20.
It would be my guess, although, there's interesting right now in the United States, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine recently settled a lawsuit which claimed that they were engaged in price fixing in the market for eggs by recommending that it be $5,000 to $10,000 as the range, is what the American Society of Reproductive Medicine recommended. And they've decided to withdraw that guidance. So it'll be interesting to see whether the price of eggs in America changes as a result or not.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting. I'm watching that as well. Okay. We could take bets off air of what we think is going to happen. All right. So, okay. So, and the major countries for surrogacy, I think you've already, in 2016 or 2015, the major countries for surrogacy abroad. Well, let's don't say abroad, because I think we would probably have to include the United States in that as well. So what are the major countries that intended parents throughout the world are seeking or going to find surrogates?
So I would say the United States is a big place because, as I said, in the United States you can, if you go to California, you can get contractual enforcement. We see a lot of tourism from Europe to the United States. That's the direction of the flow. India and Thailand continue to be big destinations, but much lower than they were 4 or 5 years ago because there have been some scandals in both countries that have led to much more of a cracking down in terms of access and also more restrictions and also more rules about who can access and who can't. But I would say those are the 3 destinations that are probably a hotspot, but the data is very kind of spotty. We know a lot about travel within Europe. We know people travel to these places, but we have no way of quantifying just how many people come to the United States or go to India or go to Thailand.
For the purpose of it seems like we would have that because it becomes an immigration issue getting the child back into the home country. So wouldn't the records be pretty good for the number of children who are conceived are born via surrogacy in another country?
So I think you could seek to get from the State Department to get data on that. There is some trickiness in terms of, and we can talk about that in a moment, about what the pathway to citizenship for children are. So, for example, can you tell the difference between children who are adopted from these places versus children who come in through reproductive technology, right? So you may have to do some fine-grained stuff, but I haven't seen anybody work with the State Department's data to be able to say with any kind of authority how many children are born through surrogacy abroad. You'd also have to try to figure out which reproductive technology service was done. In some cases it could be just gestational surrogacy as opposed to full surrogacy and stuff like that.
Well, yeah, you're right. Okay. All right. And we have been hearing a lot lately that India's laws are changing pretty dramatically right now. So what is the current status of the legality of surrogacy in India?
So there have been several bills that have put forth. The last time I looked at it, which was about a year ago, it hadn't yet been transposed into law. But I think the general sense is India and Thailand are becoming more restrictive about who can use commercial surrogacy. So, for example, gay and single individuals are facing more of I don't want to say discrimination, but more lack of access to these places. So they're no longer as good a destination for these individuals. And also there's more kind of being put in place, which I think is probably a good thing in terms of kind of regulating how surrogates are being housed, how they're being paid, what happens when someone steps away from surrogacy. But in general, my understanding from people who are on the ground is, in particular in India, which was a very robust center for fertility tourism, it's really dramatically dropped off. There's a lot more regulation that, for whatever reason, has been discouraging people from using it as a place to go.
Yeah, that's what I'm hearing as well. That's interesting. In Thailand as well, apparently.
Yeah. And, our experience with this is that when this happens, there tends to be other places that open up. It's a little bit like, a set of spouts or some pipes that when the pressure builds up, the water comes out somewhere and somewhere else. So my own guess is that you'll see increased interest in Latin America for surrogacy destinations, although there's complications there to do with religion in particular. And we've seen this, the stories, as you probably well know, in the adoption world, where actually international adoption from many parts of Latin America also became harder over time.
Well, yeah, that's to put it mildly. Shutting down almost completely in many places. And in fact, Guatemala was at one point one of the largest places, one of the largest sending countries for adoption to the United States, and it was also beginning to be looked at for a place for surrogacy as well. And that was completely shut down, I think, in 2008. It's been a while since, I think it was in 2008, from the adoption standpoint, and it's barely moving. It has barely moved since then, and I have not heard much happening with surrogacy as well. I mean, since that time as well. So, all right. One of the questions that I think intended parents need to wrestle with, and most of them do when they are thinking about going abroad for surrogacy, and I think this would apply to people in Europe coming to the United States for a surrogate, as well as intended parents in the United States going to wherever, India, Thailand, Latin America, wherever. Is surrogacy a form of exploitation? And how do we wrestle, and how do we know if it's a form of exploitation? And does it matter if the surrogate is in a highly developed country such as the United States, or the surrogate is in a developing country such as India or Thailand or one of the Latin American countries?
Yeah, so it's a very big and complicated question. You know, in the book chapter on this, I wrestle with it a little bit. So on the one hand, it depends on what I often say is when you say exploitation, you can mean a bunch of different things, and let's just play through some of them. If your concern is about the safety of the procedure, the quality of the care being given to the surrogate, the level of informed consent and understanding, I think unquestionably in developed countries, all of those things tend to be higher than in developing countries in places like India. If you're just thinking about it in terms of how much money this is for these people, I would say the wages being paid in India to surrogates, even though they're a lot less than what's paid in the United States, tend to represent a much larger share of a lifetime earning capacity for these women, significantly more. So you're talking about, really, 2 to 5 years of wages from labor is the equivalent. So in terms of the good you're doing in terms of making a real difference in someone's life, it's much more likely to be the case in India that you're doing that as opposed to in the U.S. But that cuts both ways, because you might say, well, these women are really being given offers that are so good they can't refuse them. And some people are troubled by that notion, some idea that the dollar signs are kind of blinding these women to the choices they're making. There also has been allegations. That's here in the United
States, you're saying, that the dollar signs are abroad as well, because as you point out, the contrary to what a lot of people realize, the wage of a surrogate is, as you just said, I think you just said 2 to 3 years worth. One surrogacy, what she is paid, is the equivalent of what most surrogates would be able to earn in 2 to 3 years.
That's right, and especially in a place like India. And the profile of a typical surrogate is very different in a place like India than a place like the United States. The average surrogate in the United States is high school or some college educated, right? She tends to be actually relatively middle class, typically lower middle class, but middle class nonetheless, tends to have had at least 1 or 2 successful pregnancies ahead of time, right? So these are kind of what the things that surrogacy agencies in the United States look for. And as a result, you're talking about somebody who's relatively, well educated, not at the point of being destitute. In a place like India, where most of the population lives so far below us in terms of their standard of living, right? The women who are being recruited for surrogacy are also quite poor, right? Now, it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. So on the one hand, you might say, well, this opportunity to be a surrogate is really life-changing for a woman in India in a way that it's not, to buy herself out of bonded labor, to afford a dowry, and the like. And that's a good thing. But on the other hand, you
or
might
to send
say
her other
money,
children to school, or
exactly,
other things like that, right? To raise her family out of poverty, right?
Exactly. On the other hand, you might say the money involved is so high that it gives us a concern that they're not making a rational choice. So a lot of this depends on how good you think people are at making choices about these kinds of things and how paternalistic you want to be to intervene. The other thing to think about is a little bit about the social consequences of being a surrogate and how it plays out in different societies. So one of the most interesting things about Anand, this place in India where a lot of the surrogacy takes place, is that actually there's a fair number of aunties and nieces that are both surrogates at the same time, right? So there can be families of surrogates, which is just fascinating sociologically. But there is concern that, so the women in some of the studies that have been done, the anthropological ethnographic studies, you really see a mixed bag. There's some women who feel a lot of confidence and their self-worth is improved by virtue of having been a surrogate. They consider themselves desirable and helping someone in the West in a way that actually builds their self-confidence. There are others who feel, at the end of the day, they feel as though there are these children that they produce through pregnancy that they'll never see again and won't have a connection with, right? So, this is just to say it's quite complicated. In my mind, it depends a lot on whether you think if you think the problem is exploitation, I often say to people, then you're really talking about whether someone's not being paid enough. There exists a dollar amount for which it would not be exploitative. And that's the problem. And what you want is to better establish price floors in what these women are paid, to make sure they're getting paid, to make sure they're able to actually use the money to improve their lives. I think that's much more of a life concern in a place like India than a place like the United States, where the demand and supply for surrogacy is such that I think most women in the United States get paid a considerable wage, and I think it's done in a way that's quite proper and quite well regulated within the United States. Whereas in a place like India, there's much more of a variation of experience.
Yeah, and there is a feeling, whether it's a valid feeling or not, and it may just be either a paternalistic attitude, or it could be we in the United States know best, an oblige oblige type of attitude. But there is a feeling that women here in the United States are making a more independent decision. They have other options, so it is a freer decision that they're making versus in India having that the women there, or Thailand, or whatever country, as you point out, that comes in to fill the gap, that they have so few options. But it's complicated because they have so few options, this becomes a good option for them. So to deny them this, who are you really helping?
Exactly. And this is sometimes called the hypocrisy argument, that if I say to you, you're so poor and so badly off that I'm going to deny you, because you're so poor and so badly off, I'm going to deny you this opportunity to improve your life, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to do that. I may have some kind of obligation to redistribute towards you to make you well off, to lift you out of poverty. If I'm not going to give you this way of lifting yourself out of poverty, I have an obligation to find another way to do it. But I think it's very unlikely that most of these women in India who want to be surrogates will be helped by Americans, So there is this question about whether by denying someone a choice, you are sentencing them to continue their bad situation, which is what makes you skeptical about giving them the choice in the first place. So, it's complicated, and some people also think that surrogacy is particularly complicated because it's not just that we're paying you to do something that carries some risks, but we're really paying you to suppress a particular kind of emotion, an emotional attachment to a baby you're carrying, right? So it's not just any kind of labor, if you pardon the pun, but it's an attempt to kind of get you to view yourself as a commodity, as a market good, rather than to experience pregnancy the way most women experience their pregnancy. So some people, especially some... Yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, I'm just going to say, and then that begs the question of, does it matter whether you're talking about the terms that are used, or traditional surrogacy? This is for our audience. I realize you're very aware of these terms. But traditional surrogacy, where the surrogate's egg is the one that is used. In other words, through usually artificial insemination, the intended father's sperm, although it can be donated sperm, is transferred, and the surrogate's egg, and so it's her genetic, her genetic material is used. Versus a gestational surrogate, where the egg comes from a donor or from the intended mother, the sperm comes from a donor or the intended father, so the surrogate has no genetic connection. So does that change the whole ethical argument in some way?
Yeah, I mean, so I think most people think that when you're talking about full surrogacy, what you're asking these women to do is a much more dramatic requirement of them, right? It is not only to give up a baby you've carried, but a baby with whom you share a genetic connection. Now, the interesting thing is in the United States, for example, in California, we're much more comfortable as a result with gestational surrogacy than full surrogacy, and the contracts are enforced. But one funny thing about this is that itself drives up the cost, much more expensive to actually have a separate egg donor and a separate surrogate. And also it means for the egg donors, where egg donation does carry some risks involved, some small risks of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome and the like, we're actually creating a system. If we're going to push everybody to gestational surrogacy, it means that there's a class of women who are going to bear these risks that wouldn't in a world of just pure traditional surrogacy.
That's right.
But I tend
to say nothing of in the hyperstimulation certainly being one of them, but just you're also flooding your body with these young women, often women who are paying their way through college, or that's a very typical scenario, are flooding their body with really significant drugs. These ovulatory stimulating drugs, the gonadotropins, are not, they're strong drugs. So that's the point. So who are we really protecting here? It's an interesting.
But again, the U.S. law and in general, I would say people are just much more comfortable with traditional, with gestational surrogacy than they are with full surrogacy. That's somehow dividing up this role of motherhood. And, it's really interesting because if you look at the history of reproductive technology, the earliest legal disputes about it are actually about adultery, whether women who used artificial insemination by donor were engaged in adultery or not. These are like the first cases ever decided on the subject. And I think there's some very kind of deep conceptions about kind of marriage and sanctity and keeping things as nuclear as possible. But on the one hand, what we've done is push people to consider third-party reproduction and surrogacy in order to kind of feel comfortable with there only being a gestational connection, not a genetic connection to the woman who's giving up the baby.
Mm-hmm. You are listening to Creating a Family. Today we're talking about fertility tourism, their options and the ethics. Creating a Family has the largest, or one of the largest, infertility and adoption communities on the social networks, and we would love to have you join us. There are 3 ways to find us on Facebook. You can, of course, we have a page, and that's facebook.com/creatingafamily. We also have a very large, very active support group, and that is facebook.com/groups/creatingafamily, or the easiest way is just to type in the word Creating a Family into the Facebook search box, and both the page and the group pop up, and you can like the page and join the group. You can also connect with me individually, which I go by Dawn.Davenport1. We hang out on Pinterest and Twitter as well, and we go by @CreatingAFamily there. Let's move to talking about some of the immigration issues that can occur almost exclusively with surrogacy, because the reality is with egg donation, you're coming back to the United States when you are just a few weeks pregnant. So it doesn't become, and the baby is usually born here in the United States. So the immigration issues are primarily with surrogacy. So why is there a problem if you are the intended, you plan on raising this child, and you go abroad and you hire you usually will hire an agency to help you navigate this, and you go abroad and your child is born, a child that you intend to raise and have it to be 100% your child. Why is there an immigration issue?
Yep, so it's fascinating. So believe it or not, this all relates to Ted Cruz's bid for presidency. So give me a second to explain why. An unusual tangent, but let me explain why. In the United States and all over the world, there's really 2 ways of forming citizenship. One is called jus sanguinis, by the blood. The other is jus soli, by the soil, right? So typically we have a rule that says either where you're born physically, or where you have a blood tie to one of the relative genetic tie that's been understood to mean, will you have citizenship? And some places like the United States say both, right? If you're born in the United States or born to a U.S. citizen, okay. Other places say one versus the other. So what ends up happening? So sometimes it turns out that the country from which the intended parents come and the country where the surrogate is have opposite rules such that the baby ends up with no citizenship. So, for example, the place of the intended parents has a rule of where the baby is born, and that's where the surrogate delivers, and it's a place like, let's just say, the Ukraine, right? On the flip side, Ukraine has a rule that says it's all about the genetic connection and who the genetic parents are, which should be if the parents came from the United Kingdom, for example, or Belgium, would be there. So you have these two bodies of law pointing in opposite directions, and as a result, you have a situation where the baby is not claimed or not allowed to be a citizen of either country and is born a stateless person. So that's kind of one configuration about how this can happen. The other way it can happen...
Let me interrupt just a second and say, and one of the things that you might not realize, but being a stateless person, there's no government that can give you a passport. There's no government that can allow. You can't just get on a plane, even as a 3-week-old infant, without having some form of travel document. And if you don't have a country, you have no. There's no government there's no country that can give you that.
That's right. And again, what mostly happens, we've had actually a number of cases of how exactly this happened. There was a famous one in India with a Japanese called Baby Manji. There was another case involving the Ukraine and Belgium, the Glen case, which I talk about in the book. Mm-hmm. What's ended up happening in most of these cases, at some point, one of the two governments backs down and they carve out a special exception of one kind or another, but they say this case only, and then they tell their embassies and try to notify clinics in India or elsewhere, please don't take citizens of our country. If you do, that person will be in trouble and the like. So often these pop up. In one case, it's solved but sometimes after 2 or 3 years of a child living in a... Yeah.
Yeah, the Belgium. Tell about now. This is. I don't know if this would happen currently, but this is the case between Belgium and Ukraine, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Belgium and Ukraine,
Samuel.
The Lane case. So the Baby Samuel case. So it was a situation like this where the two laws were kind of pointing in opposite directions, and essentially he's born to a surrogate in Ukraine. His parents are two men from Belgium, which allows same-sex couples to adopt, but there was difficulties getting a surrogate in Belgium. They hire a gestational surrogate in the UK. Upon birth, and this was 2008, this wasn't that long ago, the parents go to the Belgian embassy in Kiev, and the Belgian embassy says we're not going to recognize him as a citizen of Belgium because Belgian law on surrogacy didn't say we have to. There was silence on the issue. And the Ukrainians said we're not going to recognize him as a Ukrainian citizen, so couldn't get a passport, couldn't leave the Ukraine. Took 2 years and 3 months to resolve the issue. The little boy is placed first with a foster family and then a Ukrainian orphanage until finally a Belgian court rules in favor of the parents, and the Belgian Foreign Ministry agrees to give him a passport. And at that point, 2.5 years after his birth, the child is finally brought back to Belgium for the first time, and from there on leaves, presumably, we hope, a normal life. So this is a really tricky situation, and it's happened more than once. So that's one thing to think practically if you're thinking about doing one of these things is you want to make sure you're going to a place where the law in your country and the law in the destination country are simpatico. They're kind of interfacing in a way that makes sense. And the brokerage or whoever you're using, the agency to arrange this, has sophistication and experience in this particular area, that they know what they're doing and have had many prior clients like this. So that's one kind of configuration where these problems occur. The other is a case where, and this is a lot of people coming to the United States, there have been cases from France and from Spain, where surrogacy or commercial surrogacy is illegal or unavailable, it's against the law, and someone travels to the United States to get commercial surrogacy and then wants to bring the baby back. And the question is whether the parents are going to be charged with a crime and whether a place like France is required to recognize the citizenship of the child because they have a very strong anti-surrogacy policy. And one of these cases made it to the European Court of Human Rights recently. They finally forced France to basically accept the child in this particular case. But in many other parts of the world, in many other circumstances, this can be a very dicey proposition. So you have to understand whether you're committing a crime by going abroad, whether they'll let you bring the child back. And that is just something that I think most people have not a lot of experience with.
No, and they don't think about it beforehand. So what should a U.S. intended couple do, or parents do, to prevent the immigration issues bringing a child back into the United States? And let's talk about two different scenarios. One, when they have a genetic connection. In other words, either the father or the mother or both. The mother would be the egg donor, or the father would have been the sperm donor, or both, the father and the mother, the intended father and the mother. It was their genetic offspring. So is there any problem going abroad for surrogacy if at least one person of the couple has a genetic connection to the child?
So, all questions are always specific to a particular case. I will say that there's a complicated kind of regime. There's really two regimes. It depends on how you try to apply for the kid's citizenship. Do you do it when they're brought back to the United States, or do you do it from abroad? And that's going to determine whether you go through kind of the State Department or you go through the children. I'll say the Secretary of State interprets the statute to always require a blood relationship to transmit citizenship by descent. And so it says that if there's a blood relationship to a U.S. citizen, you're okay. So I'd say that circumstance, you're fine, especially if both parents are genetic parents of the child, both the mother and the father are U.S. citizens, easiest case, no problem. One of them is a genetic parent, also an easy case, although you have to be able to document your genetic citizenship, right? The idea that you have to be able to document that you are the genetic mother and you are a citizen. And there was actually,
easy enough, isn't that?
Yeah,
I mean,
you think
easy.
so. Yeah, although there actually have been cases of, for example, tragic cases of switched embryos, for example, where they determine actually at that point they actually discover that no, actually it's not the genetic child of the intended parents. And you say, well, what do you do now, right? Should they be? So that can happen. When neither of them are the genetic parents, neither of them are a U.S. citizen, neither genetic parent are a U.S. citizen, I think you're in some real trouble. And it'd be quite difficult to get citizenship if the surrogacy occurs abroad. By contrast, when you are foreign individuals, so not U.S. citizens, who use a U.S.-based surrogate, because of the rule that someone born on U.S. soil is a U.S. citizen, the child who is born is a U.S. citizen automatically, even though neither of the genetic parents are actually citizens, which is interesting. And there have been some, stuff in the news about people trying to deliver in the United States in order to achieve this. I don't know how much truth there is to that. But this is just a quirk of the fact that we allow either citizenship by descent, by genetic lineage, or citizenship based on where you're born.
And okay, so tell us the Ted. I think I know the Ted Cruz connection, but to come full circle to make sure we don't keep people in suspense. How can we blame Ted Cruz for this?
Well, I'm not blaming Ted Cruz for it, but the issue of whether Ted Cruz is eligible for citizenship or not, in part depends on the fact that we have this rule. The Constitution uses the term natural-born citizen, which might be a little bit different from just being a citizen or becoming a citizen. But Ted Cruz wasn't born in the United States, right? And his mother, there's a question about what passport his mother held when she gave birth to him. So it's no doubt that Ted Cruz is a citizen now, but there is this question about whether he was a citizen then or not, which is the same kinds of questions we ask about these tragic cases of these kids who are stuck in other places.
Yeah. Okay. So the bottom line is that if you are going abroad and for surrogacy, and you are planning on using a egg donor or sperm donor, and or both, where there will be neither of the parents, or if you're a single yourself, will have a genetic connection to this child. And the way they would find this out is they're doing a genetic test of the baby and you. So it's not like you're going to be able to slip one by. It's going to be obvious. You need to seek, before you do this, you need to see an immigration attorney in the United States who specializes in reproductive law, and there are some of those, and you should do that before you even contemplate trying to do that.
Absolutely, and I would even say, even if you're both U.S. citizens and are thinking of, it's both your gametes, it's your sperm and your egg, I would say still, if you're going to use fertility tourism at all, you want to make sure that you're having someone who advises you, who knows not only the law in the place where you're going, in India or Thailand, the law that kind of controls this, but also knows enough U.S. immigration law to adequately inform you and advise you.
Exactly, and that's a fairly unique combination: reproductive law and immigration. Yeah, but they do exist, and we've and to find some of them, we've had a number of them on the show in the past. So go to our website, creatingafamily.org. And just search for fertility tourism, or better yet, we have an A to Z, go to the tab at the top that says Infertility. Click on that. That takes you to our Infertility landing page. Click on the A to Z resources, and that takes you to our resource guide. And we have an entire section on fertility tourism where you will find all the shows that we've done on this topic. And we've had a number of these specialized attorneys who specialize in both immigration and reproductive law, and call one of those up, and even get it. It's possible to even do a consult over the phone, so you don't have to live where they are. All right. One of the potential issues to consider is and this is both tragic and particularly complex, but what happens if the intended parents back away? And that can be for any number of reasons. It could be because of divorce, and all of a sudden, it was one thing to think about being a parent, but then, after the divorce, a single parenthood is not what you're cut out for, or you think so. It can also be when there is something that is wrong with the baby. The baby is born with a birth defect. So can an intended parent back away? I mean, if you were pregnant with your own child, it would be it would be difficult. I suppose it's possible to back away, but difficult. Is that even a possibility for an intended parent to say, no, this is not what I signed up for, I've changed my mind?
So it happens, and there's a question about what kind of law kind of binds you to this.
Other than moral law, yeah.
So certainly, as a moral matter, it's a very serious thing to walk away. And there have been, there are cases that are more sympathetic and less sympathetic cases where you're told one thing about the donor, about the donor's genetic history, and it turns out not to be true. One thing, the surrogate behaves in a way differently than you thought she would during the pregnancy that causes some of the problems. So I understand where people are coming from when this does happen, but it's such a hard situation. Essentially, what you're doing is you're creating an orphan. You're creating a child who won't have any natural parentage, because typically the surrogate will not be willing to, or may not be willing to, assume parentage. I will say some places like India, some of the draft legislation in India, for example, requires that there be a local guardian who's identified and willing to take delivery of the child or hand it over to an adoption agency if the party defaults, the traveling party, the person coming from the U.S., defaults. So some countries have tried to build this in, that there is a safety valve should this happen, because, as you say, it does happen. But essentially, the question will be, can they actually force you to take the child home with you? Probably not. If you flee the jurisdiction and never go back to India, right, it's not clear that India will be able to claim jurisdiction over you or force you to do something. So there are ways out legally. I wouldn't recommend them, and I think, there's a lot of moral reasons why we shouldn't. But because we live in a complex world that's international and the limits of various countries' jurisdiction is also limited, if you do default and run away, it's not clear that anybody's going to stop you. Right now, maybe they'll claim that they're your child and register something with the State Department. But I don't know of any cases where this has escalated to the point where the destination country for fertility tourism has tried to compel the home country citizen in a case where they've tried to back away. Luckily, it hasn't happened too often, but it is kind of totally tragic on all sides of the issue. But it does result in a child often created who doesn't have a parent and who's going to have to fend for themselves in a country where the social support structure may not be that great for such children.
What about the option of the country seeking through our government to force the intended parents to at least pay child support? Have you ever heard of a case where that has been successful?
So I haven't heard of a case like that. That doesn't mean it hasn't happened. It's possible it's happened. They've just kept it quiet. But I know of no case where one country has tried to force another country's citizen to kind of pay. And it may be that actually people who do default in these situations, who do run away, end up paying the child support out of a moral obligation or a feeling of moral obligation anyways. But, it's very, very difficult for India to assert jurisdiction over an American citizen when they're back in the United States. I guess you could bring a lawsuit in India, you could find them, in default, charge them, and then seek to go to the United States to enforce a judgment in U.S. courts. That's a possibility. But I don't know of any case where that's actually happened in the context of fertility tourism.
All right. Let me remind you of some of our other wonderful gold sponsors, and this is through their support that we are able to bring you this show. Some of those gold sponsors include Nightlight Christian Adoptions and their Snowflake Embryo Adoption Program. They are offering embryo adoption services to their clients throughout the world, and they have had more than 400 babies born through the Snowflake's Embryo Adoption Program. We also have the law offices of James Fletcher Thompson. They are a South Carolina firm committed to adoption and assisted reproductive law, including providing a gestational surrogacy matching program, as well as legal services for independent surrogacy, egg donation, and embryo donation matters. And we have Manhattan Cryobank. They are dedicated to helping clients have healthy babies by analyzing a client's DNA in combination with the DNA of prospective sperm donors to provide the client with a personalized catalog of safer donor matches. This is relevant since I've just mentioned two of our sponsors who have embryo donation programs. Have you seen an uptick in embryo donation as a source of draw for either foreigners coming to the United States to partake of our embryo donation, which is sometimes called embryo adoption programs, or U.S. citizens going to other countries that might have embryo donation programs?
So it's a great question. I will say that I think that the embryo donation program is much more robust or well-established, at least well-known in the United States, so I don't know too much of Americans going abroad. For people from abroad coming to the United States, and this is not something I know about, I know that many of the programs require kind of home visits and the likes, much more similar to the adoption process to make sure the embryo is being adopted into a family that can care for it. And I don't know whether they do those home visits for foreign potential claimants. So it's not something I know about, but it's a very interesting set of questions. You've got me thinking now whether it happens or not.
And if you're interested, I can connect you to people who would know the answer to that.
I would love to know about whether they do that. Yeah.
Yeah, there's actually two different models that are used in the United States, and one is the adoption model. You're exactly right, and that follows and many, not many, but a few adoption agencies do have that type of program, including the Nightlight Snowflake Embryo Adoption Program, and that model does utilize a home study process. I don't know whether, and my guess is that there would be a way for that to be conducted, but I actually don't know the answer. There is, however, another model that is used, and that's used by some clinics who have embryos that have been donated to them. And that model does not require, for better or for worse, does not require a home study. However, many of those clinics require that the families that are going to receive the embryos be a current patient with them. So that would seem to me that would probably make it what would be the odds. I guess it could happen, though.
Especially people are coming to the United States for other kinds of treatment.
Right,
So
and already patients. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. And what about the quality of care? And in other countries, I think we know that oftentimes people are coming to the United States, if they're coming abroad for treatment here, one of the reasons it draws them is the quality of care, and certainly our reproductive sciences are very advanced and more advanced in the United States than many other countries. So that's really not so much an issue. But what about going abroad? Because if you're going abroad for surrogacy, you are utilizing the IVF labs and the reproductive endocrinologist in other countries. So you're putting a whole lot of faith in a developing world medical establishment for what's really very state-of-the-art and very high-tech medicine. Is that foolish? I mean, can they hold a candle to the quality of care? And by quality of care, I'm really referring to at this point, not the care the surrogates are getting, but the care, the protocols that are being used for the IVF itself, as well as for the embryologists and growing the embryos and things like that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, my answer to this is similar to my answer for other kinds of medical tourism. So for cardiac, just use it as a comparison, there are clinics around the world, in India, for example, who have cardiac bypass morbidity and mortality rates that are as good or better than the Mayo Clinic and our best clinics. But, that's one or two clinics in India that have shared their data, and we can say this confidently about them. The same is true for fertility. There's a big variation in the quality of care you're being provided. There are excellent clinics, and there are less good clinics out there. Just as is true in the United States, if you look at the CDC kind of data on kind of, successful implantations and stuff like that. So, my feeling of this is that you want to go to a place that does enough of these and is sharing its data and has physicians that have been trained with the right kinds of trainings. And, for the most part, one nice thing about the fertility medicine world is it's become more globalized, and more American fertility doctors, I think, are likely to know colleagues abroad than they were 10 or 15 years ago. But there are great centers. For example, Barbados has an excellent fertility center that I've actually been to before. There are others that are, much less good around the world. So it's really a question of doing your due diligence, just as you would in the United States. But some of those centers are better or as good as the best United States centers. Many are not nearly as good because, as you say, the general quality of care in the United States for reproductive medicine is very high.
We do provide some resources at Creating a Family for questions to ask to try to determine the quality of care. One of the things it's much harder to determine the quality of the medicine that you're going to be receiving, the quality of the reproductive endocrinologist as well as their laboratory in another country. There are some specific things, however, that you can ask, and I will link to that tomorrow in the blog that we do. So some of those questions to ask, things like that. We have come to the end of our time. Thank you so much, Glen Cohen, for being our guest today. For our audience, please do us a favor and give us a rating on iTunes. We are by far the number one rated show in the areas of infertility and adoption, and we would love to keep that. And iTunes utilizes your ratings. So if you could pop over to iTunes, type in Creating a Family and give us a rating, or go to our radio page on our website, creatingafamily.org/radio show, and click on the iTunes button there, and that will take you to our ratings as well. I thoroughly recommend the book, Patients Without Borders, Medical Tourism, Law, and Ethics by our guest, Glen Cohen. You can get that, you can get it online anywhere, and I suspect that a number of independent bookstores or bricks-and-mortar bookstores would have it as well. Glen, are there other places that you would tell people to get the book other than our standard Amazon?
No, I think that's good. Oxford University Press sometimes has discounts. They're the one who put out the book, so you can look for Patients Without Passports there.
Gotcha. Okay. Excellent. Thank you so much for being our guest today. I truly appreciate it, and it's been a fun show. Everyone, I will see you next week.
Paycor knows HR teams are under pressure to recruit and retain top talent. You need more than HR tech. You need expertise at the core. Meet Paycor. Our technology saves you time. Our expertise helps you make a difference. Paycor.com/meetpaycor.